In today's video, we're gonna paint up a cheerleader.
A what? What did he say?
A friggin' cheerleader, my dude. I'm talking pom-poms, bow ties, pink hair, gore, and so much more. M-I-N-I-A-C, he gonna be free. I've painted the same model over and over and over again. I've been painting 40K minis non-stop for 4 weeks straight, and while I love seeing my army come together, batch painting is consuming my soul. Let's get some of it back by painting up my first ever limited edition bust, the cheerleader. You heard that right, I only have 400 of these bombshells, well, 399 now, and I'm not making more. You can pick it up at the link in the description. I remember the exact day that I wanted to make this model. Back in February 26th of 2024, almost shockingly 1 exact year from today, the day I'm filming this. What is the date? It's the 26th! What the f? Okay. What the heck? Apparently exactly a year ago, I watched this movie and it lit a creative fire in my brain to want to make this model. And ever since then, I was just like, let's do this. This is so exciting. This is so fun. I want to try it. I don't care if it's going to be successful. With the model prepared, let's get to priming. To prime this figure, we're going to start with black, and we're going to keep it traditional. I'm going to apply a zenithal highlight using my favorite white to do that, and that is Tamiya flat white. With that undercoat down, we can now move on to doing our first base coat, which is going to be the skin tone. I'm also going to use the airbrush here just to keep everything nice and fast and also smooth. The actress who originally inspired this character's name is Havana Rose Liu, who has a combination of East Asian features, but with green eyes, reddish hair, and freckles. Now on to using the paintbrush. I take the skin tone that I just used in the airbrush and a much paler, brighter, and desaturated skin tone, and mix an intermediate color that I start to use to carve out the facial features. Because she has such a big, cheeky smile, a lot of the volumes that are often hard to see on busts are more visible. A good example of this is the orbicularis oris, or where the smile meets the cheek. There's often a little muscle there that gets accented in bust painting, even when you can't see it on the sculpt itself. And in this case, it's very obvious on the sculpt. At the moment, I'm not worried about blending. I'm just trying to get colors in the right spot. Then, with the same paint that I originally base coated in, I come back with some shadow color to cut back in some of those shapes. The grayish blackish undercoat we had made these areas look fairly desaturated, so I want to see what a full opacity saturated shadow looks like with this skin tone we have going on right now. Now I use my brightest, palest skin tone and layer up even more highlights. Normally when highlighting a face like this, I would draw a lot of the highlights right to the center of the forehead. That tends to give a result that looks more reminiscent of someone wearing makeup, but in this case I want more of a natural look, so I'm just gonna highlight the skin and face, obeying your typical rules for highlight and shadow placement. Now with the highlights and shadows blocked in, we're gonna do some smoothing. With the same 3 colors that I use to layer on the face, I dilute those to more of a glazed consistency and start to smooth the divide in between each respective layer. I'm going to be favoring the darker colors here. So in areas in between my max shadow and my midtone, I'm going to glaze that divide with my max shadow. In between my max highlight and my midtone, I'm going to glaze that divide with my midtone. I'm getting the sense right now that the face is a little bit too bright and also too colorless, and so I want to bring back some lividity by increasing the shadows and midtones, which are often more saturated than your highlights. This is about 30 minutes of work on the face, and I'm feeling pretty okay about it, and so I'm going to move on to painting the eyes before I do any more work. Step 1 on painting the eyes is to block them in with a nice dark red color. Not only will this help to separate the eyes from the skin tone, but it also mimics the redness that you see around the perimeter of human eyes. I also use the same color to block in the mouth. Not for any particular reason other than the fact that I just want to see what the face looks like with a mouth that's a different color than the skin. It gives me a better idea of how everything is going. Next, we're going to fill in the eye with a pastel pink color, which may sound a little strange at first. This is not an easy procedure, and you can even see here in the beginning that I mess up. My paint is a little bit too thin, and as soon as I start base coating, it runs right into a recess like a wash instead of staying put like a paint. That is an indicator to me that I need to mix a little bit more paint and less water into this and give it a shot on the next eye, which does go a lot better. For maximum accuracy, you always want to be painting on the downstroke to take advantage of the fact that you can rotate this model around to best encourage that kind of brushing. Now, with the white of the eye blocked in, we can start working on the iris and the pupil, which I chose to be green based on the actress who inspired this model. Now, the reason I picked pastel pink in the first place for the eye white color was because I knew I was going to do a paler green eye that also is a little bit lighter. And to try to make it stick out as much as possible, I chose something of a hue contrast for the eye white color. This is a very surgical procedure. You want a portion of the iris to be hidden under the upper lid, and you want to see the roundness of the iris by the bottom lid. With that blocked in and looking pretty good and symmetrical, I then paint in the center of the eye with a darker evergreen color. This tends to take the place of a traditional dark black pupil, which tends to look a little too crazy for a miniature, while also reinforcing the green color in a good way. Lastly, we're going to add in a specular reflection, which represents the glossiness of the eye and the reflection of a light above her into the eyes of our viewer. Nailed it on her right one, and the left one wasn't so good. I might have to redo this eye. But that's okay. Eyes are small and they're easy to paint fast. Whether or not any of those attempts end in a good-looking eye, well, that's kind of up to you and your brush skills. With her left eye fixed up, I can now solve any problems where the green iris color got onto the lower lid.
With that step done, let's hear a bit more about the conception of the cheerleader. I'm a fairly specific model designer. I have an idea for a character and I want to convey that as clearly as possible, and today's sponsor, Milanote, helps a ton with that. It's an online canvas designed to help you plan, brainstorm, and collaborate on ideas. It's a great tool for mood boarding the concept of a model, like the cheerleader. I see this phase of model creation as the most important. Your creative vision as a model designer is what separates you from your peers. And the ability to translate that vision to a concept artist is key in making every other step of the process go smoothly. With a clear mood board, your concept artist will get to the final design much faster. It's so vitally important, and having a feature-rich tool to communicate as clearly as possible is very helpful. And I have a super specific example of how helpful this can be. Initially, I designed the cheerleader's mood board in Google Slides, and due to a technical issue, my concept artist did not have access to my notes, but only the images, and this is the concept he produced. Basically, Harley Quinn, who is definitely an inspiring character, but not at all what I was going for. Once he finally had access to my images and my notes, it turned into this. Something significantly closer to the actual model that was in my head. Just a very small and simple example of how using the wrong tool for the job causes the process to take longer. Not everyone is going to want to design a model with Milanote, however. You could use it to plan a creative miniature project, from finding the right bits for a conversion to planning the scheme and where to use those colors. Milanote includes a bunch of helpful templates to get you started on your creative project, as well as a web clipper that allows you to grab images from anywhere to add to your collection. You never really know when inspiration strikes, and it's handy to have a tool right there to add to your board. When you're ready to share your work, you can invite your team to gather important feedback and collaborate with them in real time. For example, I'd share this board with my concept artist to get started and would use it to further define the model as the process continued. Milanote is available for free with no time limit, so sign up for a free account using the link in the description and get started designing your own model or creative project. All right, back to the cheerleader. With the eyes done, I'm going to start working to finish the skin on the face. And what that process looks like is holding the picture of the person I'm trying to imitate in my hand and looking back and forth at the model, trying to adjust problems on the fly. For instance, I can tell that I'm a bit too pale right now and we need some more warmth in the skin, so we're going to start there. You definitely want to go slow with this process. Matte and also light paints take glazing like a champion, so just dilute the paint and go slowly. You'll be surprised how much color you deposit onto this pastel skin tone. And I'm targeting the underside of the chin, the underside of the cheeks, the temples, the underside of the nose, and just being really sparing. A little bit goes a long way. And the same is true for the highlights. I mix a little bit of white into my brightest skin tone and target some very small areas to get some bright highlights in there. The skin is looking good, and now I want to work on the lips. I grabbed something of a wine-colored lipstick and mixed that with my skin tone. In the past, when I've done lipstick, it often looks way too stark. So by mixing it with the skin tone, not only am I lightening it up, but I'm also making it look more like the skin tone, so it's less painted on looking. I want it to look like lipstick, just not super crazy clown lipstick. With the darker color establishing the perimeter of what I think the lips are, I now take a brighter highlight color and paint inside those lines. I'm trying to keep a dark rim around the lips to act as lip liner. I'm not sure if these lips look good or bad, but I think we need to paint the rest of the mouth to figure out. I actually want to move away from the mouth to do a step that I probably should have done before I started those lips. And that's to add some freckles. But I'm not just going to add freckles to this model we've been laboring over willy-nilly. No, we're going to do a test model first. So I grabbed one of my spare busts, and we're only going to need the head for this. I base coated the test model on the same color we used for the skin on the cheerleader, and then loaded my airbrush up with a brown red ink. Then with a super low PSI and a diluted ink, I splattered that onto a paper towel just to make sure that I was getting the effect that I was after, and then after I was confident, I applied it to the test model. And it looked pretty promising. I think it's a little too dark, and so let's try a different ink. I switched over to a sepia ink, so more yellow, less brown red than the last one, and even that was too much. And I added more thinner, and even that was too much. And then I added a ton more thinner, and then we finally got to a place that was good. Look at how thin the paint is in my airbrush. You can see the needle and everything in there. It's super translucent. One thing I also noticed while doing my sepia test was that some spots on the model and the paper towel were much larger than other ones, and I figured out that it all comes down to the PSI. A super, super, super low PSI gets you bigger spots, but if you slightly dial it up, then they get smaller and smaller, which makes sense. To get a sense for how much the pressure was changing, because I was seriously turning the regulator like 1 degree at a time, I actually pointed the airbrush at my face and blew just air into my cheek constantly so I could feel how much the pressure was changing with each tiny turn of the dial.
This is why doing tests is such a great idea. I had no idea how to thin the ink that much, and also I didn't know there was so much granularity in how to get the speckles with the air pressure. But now that we've done this, now it's time to do the real thing.
Now with those tests complete and some better confidence moving forward, I'm gonna mask off the model where I don't want the freckles to end up. Taking a look at some Freckles source material, I can tell that most freckles tend to occur right in the middle of the face. So I'm gonna mask off the top and bottom with a big putty snake. This way, I hope to get more of a softer transition between freckles and no freckles, as opposed to using a harder divide like, say, masking tape might get us. With a quick prayer to the hobby gods, I gave it a shot. And it didn't look too bad. I probably got too much freckling on the underside of the cheek and instead should have focused on the upper side. Considering that, I took the bottom snake off and hit a little bit of that lower chin as well. To reduce the effect of the freckles, I just take more of my same skin color and dilute it down and just do some patient glazing over the areas where I want to reduce it. This isn't going to eliminate the problem entirely, but it's going to drastically reduce the effect, which I think is good enough.
You might notice me saying a phrase like good enough or good for now a lot, and that's because I don't really know what this is going to look like when the model is fully painted. So instead of fretting over, say, the freckles or the black tooth that I painted in, I want to paint more of the model to see what it looks like in context before I try to fix a problem that's not really even a problem.
With the freckles looking okay, we can move on to finishing the rest of the mouth, and I'll start by base coating the teeth in a warm gray. This is the color that's eventually going to be the gaps in between the teeth. It's warm because we're inside the mouth and there's gums and tongues and all sorts of pinkish stuff. And it's gray and not black because I don't want there to be black gaps in between the teeth because that would be just too aggressive. Then with the same paint that I used as my max highlight on the skin tone, I start to paint in the teeth. And this is a pretty delicate process. You want to make sure the gap in between the teeth isn't too big. So you want to keep sneaking up on that gap as much as you dare. Oh, and I also painted in one of her teeth black because that just seems right for the character. Now it's time to move on to the brows, and I start that with a warm gray color again. I want her natural hair to be black, but black is way too aggressive of a color, just like it's too aggressive for the gaps in between the teeth. Despite that, however, my first shot at doing an eyebrow wasn't very good. I mixed in even more skin tone and diluted it even more for my second attempt, and it was a lot better. The shape was at least nice and consistent. But then I went back and checked out some actual brows and realized that I had my shape wrong. And also I wanted to add a little bit of hair texture by tapping the brow super lightly with both skin tone and also that same brow color. I'm liking the look of that left brow quite a bit. Now let's mimic it for the other side. Lastly, because she is kind of a youthful character and maybe a little bit of a punk with that missing tooth, I add in that classic eyebrow razor shave you see. With the brows looking pretty good, I move on to the eyelashes, and I pick the color teal for this because teal will be an important color in our scheme later on. And then lastly, to finish off the face, I add some magenta blush. We're getting to a point in painting the face where this character is just becoming more and more the character that I envisioned in my head. And it's honestly so exciting, and one of the reasons why painting a bust is so much fun. The canvas is so much larger, and there's so much more opportunity to express humanity and do all these kinds of cool things with, you know, an eyeliner or an eyeshadow or what to do with their brows or all this different kind of stuff. It's just so much fun when you get to this stage and you really start to see it come alive. With the blush complete, I wanted to paint some of the hair just to get a final idea of what a finished version of this face would look like. With the face done and the hair blocking it all in, I'm pretty happy with what it looks like right now. So I want to move on to actually painting the hair. To start, I mixed some off-white yellow into my magenta to get some highlights. I like mixing a yellowish color with magenta because it ends up looking like a bit of a peach for the highlight. I'm targeting the middle curve of her bangs, the sides of her temples, and the big bends in her ponytail. For the next highlight, it's pretty simple. I just mix more of that off-white yellow in and just keep building up the effect. And in fact, I just keep doing that over and over again, adding a little bit more off-white yellow and building that bright highlight. With the highlights looking bright enough, I start to work in some shadows using a very dark purple color that's kind of more warm. It's a bit hard to clearly define this stage, but I'm essentially addressing issues that I'm finding as I'm just rotating the model around. I might bust out the airbrush with some darker purple ink to soften up some of the blends in the back of the hair. I might add some darker purple color to the lower side of the bangs. I might increase a highlight here or there or smooth something out. It's really weird to go from painting an army, my Dark Eldar, in the past couple of weeks, where you're constantly thinking about process and efficiency and how to scale up something, to painting a display model where there are no steps to really do it. You're just essentially problem solving on the fly constantly. Sure, you go into the painting process with an idea in mind, but I find so very often on display models specifically, because you're trying new things out, you're experimenting here, experimenting there, that often the process has a lot of small issues that need to be addressed. And the outcome is much more reliant on your ability to address those small problems than it is having a solid, defined plan going in. And honestly, I like that part of display painting. It's freeing. I don't have to be concerned with efficiency. It's all about just getting the outcome that I want, no matter how long it takes. As long as you're having fun, of course. I don't want it to ever feel like a slog. Next on the hair, I wanted to bust out my favorite fluorescent color, which is fluorescent magenta or pink. And I basically take this paint straight out of the bottle and apply it over my brightest highlights. Because when it's full opacity, it's basically a thick glaze. Like, it has awful coverage. And so it just really tints and electrifies those highlights. And like most things on display models, you need some back and forth. So after I glazed in that fluo pink, I added back some more highlight, this time mixing the fluo pink with my off-white yellow color like I did for the original magenta color. And just doing, like I said, a lot of back and forth, applying highlights, glazing some hot pink over it, and just getting smaller and smaller, making it more and more intense in both saturation, but also in brightness. With the hair looking pretty good, I wanted to add in another idea I had for this character, which is some of her black roots peeking through. Obviously, her brows are dark, and I wanted to show that that was an intentional choice by also showing some roots coming through. And I think, again, this is an appropriate choice for the character. It's like a backstory for your army inspiring paint choices. I have an idea of a certain kind of person that I'm representing right now in bust form, and just imagining that kind of person gives me all sorts of ideas. Later in the process, I even added a little tiny heart tattoo to the side of her face because I was sharing this picture with some patrons, and they had that great idea because they could imagine what she would be like and what kind of detail she would have. I love it when a model feels like it's painting itself because it just has a direction it wants you to go in, and it feels cool and it feels right. Oh, and one other product that's new to the web store is we have a new t-shirt that features a two-headed dog inspired by my two puppies, Crusher and Bullet, who were actually with me in the office while I was painting this figure because I had to watch over Bullet because she had a bit of an accident. By the way, if you're curious why this couch is flipped up, it's because Bullet here tore her ACL, and had to have surgery. And so we're trying to discourage her from jumping on things like couches. And so it's flipped up because of that. You know, me and Mom used to think that you were the problem child crusher, and then Bullet netted us a $4,000 surgery charge. Fun! You don't care. You don't care. Mwah, mwah, mwah. With the hair shaping up nicely, let's move on to that bow tie. And I want this to be a teal sequin bow tie. So I bust out a navy blue color and a teal, and I'm gonna use the white and off-white yellow already on my palette. First, I start with a base coat of that dark navy blue. Then I mixed my next layer of paint. Normally when I'm layering with miniature painting, I try to be subtle, but in this case, I want a fairly aggressive increase in brightness. I also want a lot of opacity, so I'm painting with thick paint, and I have basically a blob on the end of my brush, and I'm making dots all over this bow tie. I'm trying to avoid the deepest folds of the bow tie, keeping that navy blue preserved. I then skip straight to that teal color with no mixing, again doing the same thing, thick paint, blob on the end of the brush. What I'm essentially doing here is coarse stippling. I'm not trying to put the dots in the same place each time, but rather build up a highlight where I think would be appropriate, which in the case of sequins is kind of like non-metallic metal, or kind of like scale mail. I continue to increase in brightness, mixing white and some of that off-white yellow into my teal, adding more and more brightness, building up the color, but still not worrying about placing dots in the exact same location each time. Lastly, I end on pure white. This is another thing that I love so much about painting display models, is getting to try out things that you would never get to try out on your standard wargaming figure. How often are you going to get the opportunity to paint sequins on a Warhammer figure, for instance? So it's just really cool to be able to explore new territory. And also it's just further building up the character of who this person is. And the more we have an identity for this character, the more fun for me it is. I don't know why, but it just seems that way. Time to move on to the body. I base coated the rest of the model at the same time that I base the face, so my first step here is to apply a highlight. And I'm using the same colors that I used on the face here on the torso and arms. This is a big part of the model, all the skin, but we're not gonna go over too much of it in this video because the process is very similar to the face. There's just more surface area and the volumes are slightly different. First up, I'll do a scratchy highlight of the base tone you see on the model now, mixed half and half with a highlight color. I'm not too worried about being neat here. I wanna just get paint in the right spot. Here you can see my finished version of this step. And I'll skip straight to the brighter highlight, doing the exact same thing, applying layers of highlight within the previous step, building them up layer by layer. Like I've said in previous videos, one of the advantages of acrylic paint is that it's fairly translucent. I can work with layers of paint diluted with water and slowly build up a transition without needing to mix too many intermediate colors. This works especially well on a range of paint that is matte. With those two first layers of highlight added, I now go back to the original base tone that I used on the skin, and I dilute it pretty heavily and start to soften some of these scratchier, messier looking shadow areas. With some more saturation in the skin, I decide to do one last super intense highlight with a mixture of that bright skin tone, white, and off-white yellow to maintain some saturation in the highlights. I'm making sure to keep these super bright highlights as small as I can. You don't need a lot of this to get the impact of having it on the model. Now with an even darker and richer skin tone diluted and in my airbrush, I apply some very selective shadows like under the arms or on the sides of the back or on the rib cage. This brings some saturation back to the skin as well as increasing the contrast. Lastly, I wanted to add some more of those freckles by doing the same thing, watering down some brown paint, lowering the PSI of my airbrush as much as I dare, and very carefully speckling tiny little brown spots all over the skin. Lastly, for the skin, we gotta add some tattoos. To start that process, I'll mix some of my bright skin tone into a black. The kind of person that has face tattoos is definitely gonna have a tramp stamp, and that tramp stamp is definitely gonna be stars, or a butterfly, but stars are easier to freehand, so we'll go with that. Gray is a great color to work from this freehand because it's much easier to correct that color than it would be pure black, which I definitely had to do on every single star. If you struggle with freehand, I made a video all about freehand that contains tips just like that last one. I'll link it below in the description. I added one big star and then a slightly smaller star right next to it, and of course, I mirrored it on the other side. Once I had the shape determined, I add some black to the top part of the tattoo, which is the part that's receiving less light because her hips seem to be flaring out at the bottom. I know I already said it, but the more I paint this model and the more I add details just like this, the more the whole paint job comes together and excites me more and more. Time to work on the wrapping on the baseball bat and the hands. Because I have it on my palette, I mixed together an off-white yellow and a purple with hopes to get a grayish color. I think in this case, the purple was a little bit too strong, and so I mixed in a little bit of dark gray to get it to the desaturated point that I wanted, and then base coated all the various elements. With the base coat nice and opaque, I mix in some off-white yellow and some white into that mixture to get a highlight color, but this wasn't really working out very well. It wasn't bright enough, and I felt like I was largely wasting my time with this step. So my next step was to mix more purple and dark gray into that midtone to get a shadow color. I used this color to add general shading to the volumes of the hand, but also to recess shade all the straps so they'd pop out nicely. Lastly, I mix in even more white and off-white yellow to get another highlight, and finally end on a pure white edge highlight that I am diluting with quite a bit of water, so it does dry to not a totally white finish, but more of a translucent one. And that should about do it for the hand wraps. Now, let's make them bloody. Now, I've done bloody bandages once before, actually on my other model, the Ranger, and it didn't really look good and just ended up in me having to repaint the bandages red, and that's not what I want to do here. So I'm gonna try something different. I'm going to use some diluted red and black ink mixture and then airbrush it onto the knuckles where I want most of the staining to be. The idea is that there's blood under the bandages and it's dyeing the fabric on top. And that worked out really nicely. And then I took some Tamiya clear red and some black ink and mixed them together to get kind of a muddy red color. And then took a very small piece of sponge that I ripped off of another larger chunk, and with some tweezers just dotted on these tiny little high gloss bits of who knows what, gore, flesh, stuff that's been left over from when she's been just wailing on some dude. And it looks so good. It looks so much better than my last attempt, and it was so much easier as well. Yes. I also wanted to, of course, add some gore in between the fingers. I love doing that. And of course, she's got painted fingernails as well. And I chose my spot color of teal for those fingernails. I love the comparisons going on this miniature. On one hand, she's a cheerleader, and society probably has ideas about what kind of person a cheerleader can be. But on the other end, she's also just like covered in like gore and has like crazy tattoos and piercings. I just love it. The character is just so much fun to paint. Lastly, I added on some super diluted sepia ink just near the hand wraps and near where she grips the bat to imply some kind of sweat or other dirt and grime that's building up. With a fairly saturated ochre color, I start with a base coat, and then while it's still wet, I wet blend in some bleached bone color right on top. I'm not too worried about getting a smooth gradient on this. In fact, I kind of want some brush strokes running vertically along the bat to imply some wood grain. When that dries, I just kind of do it again, but this time a little bit more haphazardly. I'm using that pure cream color or that color mixed with the ochre and diluted, and just running my brush along the entire length of the bat, trying to get, again, more of that wood grain. But it doesn't matter too much to get a perfect result because obviously we're covering this thing in some gore, using the exact same technique as before with Tamiya clear red and some black ink. And I agitate this stuff as it's drying because I want to create a physical texture, you know? She probably just brained some dude, so I want some freaking cranium on this bat. So as it's drying, I'll touch it repeatedly to get some chunky texture. I want the majority of the gore to be right in that sweet spot, but I also want to kind of taper it out as well. Something I wanted to mention about the bat while I paint it here is that originally I sculpted some gore to be on the bat, like blood dripping off of it. But then I kind of had the idea that I want you to be able to interpret this model however you see fit. Yes, the character is kind of leading you in a direction, but I want you to add whatever you want to the bat, whether it's a decal of a Louisville Slugger logo or blood like I did here, or cotton candy, or whatever it is. I kind of hate it when the model is just covered in sculpted detail. I love to have creative input on a model, if that's not clear so far in this video. And so I wanted to remove anything that was too specific. You know what I mean? And the same thing is true of this jersey that I'm now painting in a desaturated lilac color. I could have had some sculpted college letters on the jersey, but instead I wanted it to be blank so that you could do whatever you wanted to the model. You could add some college letters or some shapes, or in my case, I think I'm gonna do a cartoony skull. But let's finish the shirt first. With the base coat on the suit done, I begin to add in some rough highlights, which I just get from mixing white into that desaturated lilac color. And this takes time to build some opacity up. I don't mix newer, brighter highlights. I just keep using the exact same layer over and over and over again to build up some opacity. Ultimately though, it doesn't need to be perfect because of my next step. I'm gonna cover the skin in some masking putty so that I can just smooth some of these blends out with an airbrush. I probably should have done the suit first and then the skin second, but that's okay, I didn't think of it. With all the skin masked off, I begin to smooth the blends with the airbrush using the same midtone that I used and the same highlight as well. It really speeds up this process of getting big blends across these large surfaces. Also, while the skin was masked off, I shaded the jersey further with a more saturated and darker shadow color. Trying to do a colorful white is like playing chicken. You don't want to go too far, and so it's best to stay light and desaturated and to introduce the color after you've already gotten your highlights and shadows in the right spot. At the very end, there were some smaller volumes, like some wrinkles in the jersey that I had to paint with a paintbrush, but honestly, not many. On to the fun part. And the fun part is that aforementioned freehand. Now, I'm a big fan of movies. I watch between 70 and 120 movies every single year. And one of my favorite all-time movies ever is Scott Pilgrim. And in that movie, Scott himself wears this cool black and white shirt with kind of a pixelized skull on it. And I want to reinterpret that skull for my cheerleader here in some teal colors, which is like my spot color. Luckily for me, the skull isn't too hard to do because really it's just a bunch of rectangles. And if you take it slowly and you do it shape by shape, it's pretty simple. Sometimes shapes with hard edges are actually kind of challenging to do because the corners get a little fuzzy, but with some patience and also some back and forth with the color of the shirt and the color of the freehand, it's not too challenging. You just need some patience and also some brush control. With the jersey done, I'm gonna move on to the trim of the jersey, which I'll paint with our spot color again, the teal. And this is one of those steps that is not very complicated, but just takes forever. I bulked out most of this color with a larger brush and then came back in with a small, super fine brush to make sure I was hitting all the edges of this slightly thicker banding. But man, it took some time. I'm gonna steal an idea from my concept artist, who I don't think I've mentioned yet, is Cameron Stewart, the perfect guy for this job. But he chose to have this banding be kind of a metallic-y, reflective finish, and I wanna do the same thing. And really that just comes down to knowing where to put the highlights. I'm gonna mix in some off-white yellow and some white and just keep increasing the brightness to have a nice reflective highlight. And I'm basically gonna do this all over the model, and it's gonna be done in 3, 2, 1. Nice, that looks great. But it isn't perfect. The last thing we're gonna do is just add an edge highlight to all the rest of the banding. Now it looks awesome. Coming close to the finish line here, I'm running low on creative juju, so I wanted to get a little pick-me-up by gluing the arm and head on. I suggest not dropping the head in the palette right in front of you. That gives you anti-juju. Despite that near fail, it was looking pretty awesome, and I was really hyped. Let's finish this model off. To paint the pom-pom, I first base coated it in a dark purple. This is definitely the first time that I've painted pom-poms, and also it's the first time I've broken out these metallic paints. I've had these metallic paints for years and never had a reason to use pink, purple, and peach. And now I do. I just base coat the various tassels, avoiding the deepest recesses, and that's it. We're done. Ooh, wait, I forgot one thing. We need some blood splatter. And I better not mess up right at the very end. Oops. And after I quickly fixed that issue, that is the cheerleader finally complete. And I gotta say that this model did everything that I wanted it to do. I've been painting 40K models for a couple of weeks in a row, like I mentioned in the intro of this video, and this was just such a lovely break from that. You know, batch painting, obviously it isn't for everyone. It's a necessary evil when you're painting an army of dudes, but it can really affect the love of the actual painting of miniatures when you're not doing anything new and creative and fun, and you're just doing the same thing over and over and over again. You know, like I love seeing that painted army, but I also love enjoying the process as well. And I really enjoyed the process of painting the cheerleader, mostly because the model just has a lot of space to be creative and just to do fun things. I don't know why it's so important for me, but I love to have some kind of creative input on a miniature. And I feel like I thought about that going into making this model, and it feels like I accomplished it, and that feels really good, honestly. It's just so much fun to make miniatures. It's been such a while since I've done the 3 wood elves that I did in my Kickstarter campaign, and even longer before that, since I did the Duchess, the vampire miniature that I made. All those things you can find on the web store right now. And it just feels great. It feels great to do it, and it's just a fun thing that I'm never gonna stop doing. I'm always gonna wanna make models just because I have a lot of fun ideas for things that I want to see exist, and it's just so much fun to paint them, honestly. Obviously, I made this model and I'm trying to sell them, so you gotta take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. But I hope that if you enjoy this figure, and if you enjoy having like a little bit of creative input on the model and being able to express some of that creativity with your miniature painting, that you would consider picking up the Mini. You can find it linked below. Again, there are only 400 of them, and I'm not making any other ones. And yeah, just let me know. Let me know about the model. I was really concerned with whether or not people are going to enjoy the subject of kind of a gritty cheerleader. I hope you guys do, and I hope you guys enjoy painting it. And when you do paint it, I want to see submissions online. Give me the hashtag Miniac cheerleader, and I will repost it on Facebook, on Instagram. I would love to see all the different ways that people can interpret this character. I think there are quite a few that are yet to be discovered. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. There are a lot of videos on my channel of me painting busts and display models. I'll link them all at the end of this video if you like this kind of thing. If you like the channel, you want to support it, it's pretty simple. Just pick up a cheerleader. That's an amazing way to support the channel. If you are an intermediate painter looking to really push your skills to the next level, I also make a lot of masterclass courses where I walk you through painting a box art for one of my miniatures. But it's not just the box art, it's also all the information and theory required to understand the choices that the painters are making. And I say painters because it's not just me who is an educator in these masterclass courses. I also have one from Ninjon, the popular YouTuber, and Benjamin Cantor, a multi-Golden Demon Crystal Brush winning painter. So there's a good variety of people you can get information from if that's the kind of thing you're seeking out. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint.